Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and with video here on YouTube. All right, folks, this week, this is actually going to be kind of fun. I've got Clint Heacock is back, and I'm going to intro him in just a second here. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually go to probably the most seminal work on destructive cults, that real formal, academic study of this, which was done by Robert Lifton. And he wrote a book called The Psychology of Totalism, and was investigating the whole concept of brainwashing and mind control and thought reform back in the late 50s, early 60s. And this was a result of getting hold of people who had been coming out from China after its revolution, and these people were foreign nationals who were in China for the most part, who had been trapped there or stuck there and put into re-education camps, and had been through some really, when we talk about Maoist reconditioning, this is the time period and the efforts that were made against those people. This is what we're talking about, and it was thought reform. They were made through physical, emotional, psychological means to basically claim loyalty to China, to say that their past beliefs and nationalist ideas and personal beliefs or religious beliefs, this included ministers and pastors, were false, were no good, that were against what was good from the Chinese, Communist Chinese Party's point of view. And it was effective. These people actually went on TV. I mean, they were televised people while they were held in China who were recanting their former beliefs or their former loyalties or nationalist allegiances, and people were like, "What is up with this? This is crazy. What are these Chinese people doing to these people?" And as they started being released from China, they got in Lifton's hands and other people's hands, and there was research, real valid research and counseling and therapy given to these people, and they started undoing some of the thought reform and the techniques that were used, and they figured out what was being done to these people. And through the course of that, learned some of the most basic techniques that you can use in order to basically forcefully change somebody's mind. And do it without their consent is sort of the idea here. This is undue influence. This is all the things that we talk about were utilized. And this is when this was first being learned about in the Western world. So what we thought we would do. So Clint, hey, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. Glad to be on the show.
Absolutely, and thank you for this, because this was 100% your idea, and we're doing this thing here together, and I definitely want to give you full kudos on this, because I thought this was a brilliant idea for a show.
Well, it absolutely is, because as we were talking before we hit record, the key to the whole thing for me has been comparing. There's an article that Robert Lifton wrote in, I think, 1982 called Cult Formation. And I read that. Then I went back and read his book, as you say, which came out in the late early 60s?
I believe it was the early 60s, yeah.
And when I came to the end, the last few chapters, I realized that he has the whole article in this book. He actually wrote the article later off the back of the book. But in the book, he goes into not only the 8 sort of markers of cults, but also the psychological effects on people, which he doesn't do in the article. So in the piece I sent you today, I've combined the two, so maybe we can talk about not only the tactic itself, but also how it affects people psychologically.
Exactly. And you've done a bang-up job here with this, and we're going to walk through this point by point. And this might be a little lengthier than an average hour podcast, but it'll be time well spent, I believe, for us and for our audience. And we're going to do a little compare and contrast, because, Clint, your background... evangelical minister?
Yes, ex-pastor, ex-Bible college teacher. I spent basically all my adult life either in academic theological education or ministry of some kind, full-time ministry. So over 20 years in fundamentalism, evangelicalism.
Right. And of course, fundamentalism and evangelicalism we can use as terms to describe a religious belief system or construct that is pretty extreme. It goes pretty, and by extreme I mean it's a very deep, very deeply held beliefs that inform action and in a very strong way. These are not casual beliefs. Would I be right in saying that?
Absolutely. It's a totalist system. It really is, because as we'll see in a minute with when we get into Lifton's sort of talking points, it hits sort of all the markers, I think, of a cult. And that's really when the lights came on for me. Okay, you're an ex-Scientologist, I'm an ex-evangelical, but I would have looked at you as a cult member and me as not a cult member, when I was an evangelical. But now I've actually gone back and I've done a lot of work applying cult psychology to the world of evangelicalism. And some of the most extreme ones we see, of course, right now are the evangelical support for Trump, which we've talked about before. And that is kind of a political cult of personality, but the system has fed itself into the sort of blind support for him. So it's quite fascinating.
I agree completely. And of course, my background is with the Church of Scientology, which pretty much everybody who's not a Scientologist knows is a destructive cult. And really is built around the concept of scamming people for as much money as it can, with a lot of religious cloaking and smoke and mirrors and, between those things. So I think we're going to have some interesting things to talk about here.
Mm.
And I think we are going to have some future episodes where we will be getting into more of the cult of Trump and the marriage of evangelicism and Trumpism, and the dangers of those things, to the United States as a country, not just at a personal level. But that'll be in the future. So for now, why don't we go ahead and start tackling these points? And you've listed out Lifton's 8 markers of cults or cult formation. And the first of those, and I'm really excited about this because I think there's only been 1 or 2 videos in the entire body of work I've put together. I've referred to the bite model, which is Steve Hassan's model. I've talked extensively with former therapists with therapists, former cult members, such as yourself, other people, about the abusive relationship aspect of destructive cults, and how that's basically when you strip everything else away, that's basically what you've got. But Lifton, like I said, is the OG on this. He's the one who really put the original work together on this, and his breakdown. These 8 points here are what all of us tend to go and fall back on or find out about, and then realize, oh, this is where it really all comes together. And so let's go through these. The first one is milieu control. And milieu is another word for maybe environment. And the description you wrote here from Lifton's work: the control of all communication within the environment, which correlates, of course, to Hassan's information control in the bite model. Lifton comments, quote, "In such an environment, individual autonomy becomes a threat to the group. There is an attempt to manage an individual's inner communication. Milieu control is maintained and expressed by intense group process, continuous psychological pressure, and isolation by geographical distance, unavailability of transportation, or even physical restraint. Often the group creates an increasingly intense sequence of events, such as seminars, lectures, and encounters, which makes leaving extremely difficult, both physically and psychologically." And then as far as effect, like you mentioned, effect on individuals from a psychological perspective, Lifton comments, quote, "The most basic is the disruption of balance between self and outside world. Pressured toward a merger of internal and external milieu, the individual encounters a profound threat to his personal autonomy. He is deprived of the combination of external information and inner reflection which anyone requires to test the realities of the environment and to maintain a measure of identity separate from it. At this point, he is subject to the hostility of suffocation, the resentful awareness that his strivings toward new information, independent judgment, and self expression are being thwarted. End quote. So that's Lifton's first point on milieu control. Why don't you go ahead and go first on this as to how you encountered this in your groups, in the groups you were involved in?
Well, I think you said it's the creation of that experience, and one of the things I was going to comment on, zooming back a little bit, as we go through
Yeah,
these eight, I
yeah.
think what we'll see is that each one, in some way or another, will connect to the previous one or the one before it. So as we'll see, the next one connects to milieu control, which I don't want to spoil the next one if people don't don't know these eight, but we'll see that there's an overlap between them, because in this milieu control, like you said, it's almost this sense of religious addiction. You can only, like in evangelicalism, there's these immense powerful worship services and these experiences that are just, they are powerful, and they do absolutely produce an emotional response. And every week you go back and you want more of that and more of God, as they would say. I want more of God, I want more of God. And I've been studying Bethel Redding, which in preparation for our other podcast that we're going to do on dominion theology, and that's one of the most successful churches in America, if not the world, in creating an experience. They've got some amazing draws, basically, that will suck people in. They do all sorts of charismatic stuff. There's gold dust floating from the ceiling and all. I mean, just all sorts of stuff, and people just are flocking literally from all over the world to Redding, California, to go to Bethel Church to experience this. And it's a milieu. Then when you get in it, you're in the bubble, and like Lifton says, you're increasingly cut off from the outside world, as it were, and you become that religious self, and you're only in that bubble.
Exactly. I was going to use exactly that. This is the point of being in a bubble world. It is an
Mm-hmm.
artificially created reality or construct that you accept and you go into. It's a step by step process. You don't just walk right into it and suddenly, as we've talked about with Scientology, it's not Xenu on day one. It's not space aliens on day one. It's not spaceships and, interstellar conflicts. It's how can we help you with your job, or how can we help you with your family? And you're gradually led into this. Nobody joins a cult knowing that that's what they're doing. So spend more time with God. Well, that certainly sounds like a good idea.
Sounds great.
What could go wrong? But this
Yeah.
idea of milieu control it becomes an all-encompassing thing. And in the world of Scientology, this certainly occurred for me when I started being fed for me, it was the literature and Hubbard's lectures about how important Scientology was as a body of methods, of methodology to improve yourself, sure, but actually what we're really doing is we're saving the world.
Mm.
We are creating a whole new world, and that's an interesting way of looking at milieu control. Is we're actually reshaping the entire world into this new image. But what you're and you buy into this, and you sort of, for me at least, I sort of filtered all of my experiences from that point forward were filtered through this lens of how does this compare to this ideal scene. That's the term in Scientology, the
Mm.
ideal scene, this ideal world situation that is being created. And it's either making that happen and moving forward in that direction, or it's stopping that from happening and is therefore evil and bad and wrong. If it's Scientology's worldview, it's good. If it's anything else, it's destructive, and it's trying to actually bring about the destruction of the world. And
Mm.
it was amazingly easy to produce this this
Absolutely.
this sort of milieu, this environment, this idea that this
Mm.
was the world I was living in now.
You're in that bubble, and it's a
Yeah.
powerful thing to think that you're part of a system or something that's bigger than yourself, and it's gonna change the world.
Yes.
That's huge, and like you say, that's what some of the things that bring you in. I read an article the other day, and this woman was talking about, she's an ex-cultist, and she says It's the propaganda that gets you in the door. Then comes the indoctrination, and then they've got you. You know, the
That's
love
right.
bombing and all the tactics that we're all familiar with to draw people in, and it's amazing. It's wonderful at first. It's just that as the further down the milieu that you get in, and you're more and more controlled, your identity goes away, and you become shaped into their identity, what they want you to be.
That's right. And the key to this, to understanding this, is understanding that it is an artificial construct. You
Mm,
know, there's nothing wrong with optimism, and I don't want to confuse this with anything like that, or having, excuse me, having stellar goals, or having the idea of improving things in the world. Those aren't bad things. There's nothing wrong with
sure.
wanting to have a positive effect on the world, or wanting to contribute to charities. But the thing with milieu control is it's an all-encompassing, you know, your entire environment becomes defined by what the cult says your environment is, and what
Hmm.
your worldview should be, and how we should all act. And there's, you know, all the entire process of, as you just mentioned, the personality shifting that occurs, where you start thinking that the cult leader is the one to be emulated. He's the guy or girl or people who I should be following, who I should be emulating, whose conduct I should be
Mm.
emulating. And in Scientology, it was, what would Ron do?
And we say, what would Jesus do?
Yes,
So,
exactly.
just
That's
replace
right.
the name with someone else.
That's
We even
exactly
have
right.
bracelets, WWJD, and necklaces. And
Yes, Scientology had clear bracelets with the Scientology
yeah.
symbol or the OT symbol on them, and of course lots of necklaces, earrings, whatever.
Hmm.
There's um, car decals. I mean, there's all kinds of ways
Oh yeah,
to
absolutely.
identify. And but I just wanted to sort of differentiate, because people could become perhaps confused if they start thinking, well, you know, here's a group who's saying that they are trying to do, you know, do better for the world, or make the world a better place. And that's not the defining characteristic. It is the degree of control which is exerted over the members that we're talking about, not so much the purpose or stated goals or intentions of the group. It's how much control are they exerting mentally, psychologically, as well as physically. I mean, we have in
Yeah.
Scientology barbed wire fences and spiked gates, and actual security guards walking around in uniforms, patrolling the areas and watching internally. There's the security in Scientology at the Sea Org bases is all about watching the Sea Org members more than it is watching the outside world.
Mm.
So, and if you tried to leave the base, there were many, many times where I tried to just go to the store and was stopped by a security guard on the bike. You know, where you going? What you doing? What's happening? Where's your authorization to leave the base?
Mm.
And if that's not milieu control, I don't know what
I
is.
don't know what is. And that's an
It's
extreme example, isn't it? You're talking about a cult compound, literally, with barbed wire and guards and roving patrols and everything else. I mean, most evangelical churches obviously are not going to be in that extreme of an example. However, the psychological control is the same kind of thing, isn't it? Where you're it's and he says that the isolation, being in that bubble, makes it more and more and more difficult for a person to leave. So you might not be physically restrained like you were, but it's hard to leave. You're in that bubble, like Rick Ross said, you're plugged into their system. You're receiving their downloads, and they're indoctrinating you, and it's very, very difficult to walk away from all that when you're in that milieu.
Exactly. And I guess as a final note on this, we can even bring this down to relationships. You know, you have battered wife syndrome, or you have situations where you have a narcissistic relationship, and your entire worldview of that, you know, that relationship becomes all encompassing to you, and you can't even dream of walking away. You know, it's the bad boyfriend thing. It's like, look, he's bad for you. Yes, but he's all I've got, and if I leave, I won't have anything. You know, it's not that's not exactly milieu control, but it's a symptom of it. You know, when
Yeah,
somebody is
absolutely.
is so enmeshed in their world that they can't even imagine stepping out of it, or changing it up. So,
Mm.
okay, well, let's go to the second point. This is fun,
Yeah.
and interesting to talk about this. You know, obviously the subject is not fun and the topic is horrible, but just, you know, yeah, the Lifton's he really is the past master at this. He really does know what he's
Hmm.
talking about. So the second step is mystical manipulation, or quote unquote planned spontaneity. And
I
those
love
two
that
words
one.
are a little mutually exclusive, right?
Yeah.
What Lifton refers to as the quote, the psychology of the pawn, Pawn. He says, quote, the process is managed so that it appears to arise spontaneously. To its objects, it rarely feels like manipulation. Religious techniques such as fasting, chanting, and limited sleep are used, end quote. And he says here, in terms of psychological effect, Lifton points out that, quote, the psychological responses to this manipulative approach revolve about the basic polarity of trust and mistrust. One is asked to accept these manipulations on the basis of ultimate trust or faith. But such elemental trust is difficult to maintain, and even the strongest can be dissipated by constant manipulation. All right, so again, let's go ahead and start with you as to how did you experience mystical manipulation or planned spontaneity as an evangelical?
I think it's the most clear example of what goes on in so many evangelical churches, that the planned spontaneity is, you see that in the worship service aspect of it, because it appears free flowing. It appears, we would say, it's flowing with the Holy Spirit, and whoa, all these amazing things are happening. But the fact is, the whole thing is carefully controlled. It's carefully managed in terms of the songs that they pick, the types of music they start with and they conclude with. They start with a lot of fast, upbeat songs and get everybody up and rocking, and then they bring everything down. The lighting comes down, the songs slow down, it's more introspective, and everything is flowing into this moment. And then the preacher steps up, and here comes the sermon, but you're receptive to it because you've been on this emotional journey because of this planned spontaneity. It seems free flowing, and yeah, there's an element of things just kind of change and shift, because I played in worship bands for years, and if something was, if we were feeling it, we'd keep it going. If the crowd was into it, we and there's that. But I play in a band now, and we play secular rock and roll, and it's the same thing. If the crowd is singing the chorus of the song we're playing, we'll keep it going. you know so is that mystical manipulation if we're playing ACDC? I don't know.
Well, I think what you lack there is the manipulation aspect
All right, we just
of it,
want to
right?
have a good
Just having a
time.
good time, yeah. I
Rock and roll,
think,
man.
yeah, exactly. I was thinking about this with Scientology, and I can think of two examples where I think this comes up, and one might be easier to explain than the other. But let me take a stab at this. The first one is what they call reg cycles, or where they're sales. They're trying to sell you something, and
Mm.
these appear to be, or can often appear to be, as it says here, spontaneous activity, right? You sit down with the salesperson, they're talking to you about seemingly innocuous things. How's it going? How was this? How was that? And then slowly it starts going into, okay, good. Tell me about, how was your last service? Like maybe it's, you finished a service, you're going to do another one, and they're going to sell it to you, and it's going to be a lot more expensive than the last service you did. So they're going to have to sell you. But the sales thing is, the manipulation comes in here. It's not just a regular sales
Pitch. Yeah.
conversation or pitch.
Right.
Yeah. The thing that most people don't know going into a Scientology, I'll call it a sales cycle because that's what they call it, or a registration cycle.
Mm.
Um, what most people don't know is these are carefully planned out before the person ever sits down, right? The salesperson is told all about this person, what they've experienced on their last service, what got them on that service in the first place. In other words, what their buttons are. What is it that appeals to that person specifically? And then through the course of conversation during the reg cycle, the reg who's actually good at their job with this and manipulating the person will use these buttons, will use these psychological push button sort of things, like the guy came in to handle his marriage, and so, well, how's your marriage going? And well, it's going okay, but it's not really going great yet, is it? And
Mm.
it's like they're going to start playing on this. And I'm being a little bit blunt. It's actually even more subtle than what I'm saying here. But I thought of this in regards to this because it itself has resulted in people in tears, people breaking down. The subject, the target of the sale is kind of manipulated into this emotionally, into this sort of hopelessness, or this sort of depressed, isn't it all awful? It's ruining your life. This is what they say in Scientology. It's your ruin, right? What's your ruin? What's the thing that's ruining your life? And that is used to drive a person down and sort of beat them down to get them to a place where they're like so desperate for change and so desperate to do something about it that they'll give over any amount of money. That's the target. That's exactly what is trying to be accomplished in that sales cycle. Is they want to beat this guy down and get as much money out of him as possible, with the promise and the trust or the faith aspect comes into this, because the faith aspect is Scientology, of course, is going to resolve this for you. Mm-hmm. So that's why you have to give me the money. And as difficult or painful as it might be to, cash out your kid's college fund, you really do want to deal with this, don't you? It is ruining your life, isn't it? And the guy is literally there in tears, or the woman is there just like, having
falling apart.
Yeah, and they were manipulated into that. They didn't walk in there in that condition, but they get pushed into it. So that's probably a fairly crass example of this, but I include it in the Scientology world because Scientology revolves so much around money. And even as much as I've talked about this, I really don't know that I've gotten across how much of a thing that is in the world of Scientology. The other thing that comes to mind, and I'll try to be brief about this because it's a really, really complicated thing. There's a lot of layers to this, but the auditing, the counseling or therapy that is done in Scientology, and I use the words counseling and therapy only for the sake of analogy, so that people can kind of grok what I'm talking about when there's an auditor who's like a therapist, and there's the person who's getting counseling. And they call it spiritual counseling in Scientology, but the preferred word is auditing. And it resembles therapy in a certain way, so I have to use those words, but I'm not using them with the pretense that it's actually therapeutic. Because there's a lot of hypnotism, and there's a lot of trance induction, specifically, is what I mean by that. And there are lots and lots of levels of manipulation occurring in every auditing session. And when they talk here about, when Lifton mentions planned spontaneity, the process is managed so that it appears to arise spontaneously. Well, in an auditing session, it's a very structured, formalized process. The subject matter that comes up in an auditing process or an auditing session might be different from one person to another, but the procedure is very, very similar, one to the next to the next. And this, in the same way that, fasting is a procedure that you would follow, or chanting is a procedure you would follow, or auditing is a procedure you would follow. And it induces trance, and it induces euphoria. There's a euphoric feeling at the end, which is why people like it, and why it actually becomes even a bit addictive for some personalities. I observed that while I was in Scientology, that people would actually get addicted to auditing and, shelling out, again, hundreds of dollars per hour for the auditing. And this is playing on the person's trust, right? The idea that this auditing is resulting in permanent spiritual gain, that I will no longer have this problem with my wife or my kids or myself or my job or whatever it is, whatever problem the person is addressing. And Scientology auditing pretends to eventually address all your problems and raise you up to this wonderful spiritual level. And yet, you have people who have received thousands of hours of auditing who in the real world go bankrupt, commit suicide, get cancer. Every bad thing that can happen to you in life happens to people who've had thousands of hours of auditing They're not superhuman. They don't have superhuman abilities. They don't have
Mm-hmm.
mystical, spiritual abilities. And as long as Scientology can keep manipulating their trust or faith that they will get those things, this works. And that's why I thought, so the sales and then the auditing are two places where this appears in Scientology in
Yeah,
a general sense.
it's a good examples, because I love the fact he calls it the psychology of the pawn. It's like
Yes.
the chessboard. The pawn is this figure on the chessboard. A hand grabs it and moves it. The pawn doesn't know that this is all happening. I mean, I was thinking your example of red cycles, that could be compared to the evangelical or fundamentalist revival service. And what you do is you manipulate, and it's well known, the preacher can manipulate the audience to a point where they are in such despair, because they're going to hell, and you can paint this vivid picture. I mean, the classic example is Jonathan Edwards back in the 18th century, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
Yes.
His audience was throwing themselves on the floor, weeping, crying, wailing, begging God for mercy, because he had whipped them up into this frenzy of emotion, how bad hell was going to be for them. And the resolution then was salvation. So there you bring the audience to a point, and then you offer the gospel, and they're saved, and you've alleviated their problem now by handing them the gospel message. But you've worked them into that, as the pawn. You've manipulated them. They think it's all spontaneous, but it's not. It's all controlled.
Exactly. Very, very controlled. And the systems in Scientology are, um, um, uh, it is a velvet glove over an iron hand. That iron hand is real. It is, granite.
Very
I mean,
real.
it's very, very real. It is controlling every move you're making, but it is brilliantly put together to appear that you're the one making the decisions, even in the auditing sessions and the processes themselves. So yeah, it's nasty stuff when you can see behind the curtain, but it really takes quite a bit of work to get to the place where you can see all of the manipulations that are occurring. None of them are obvious. And most
Exactly.
Scientologists, even ex-Scientologists, would fight on this point and I wasn't manipulated. My auditing was, it was, I was in charge the whole time, sort of thing. And you're like, yeah, no,
You
no,
really weren't.
you really weren't. Okay, well, let's go to the next point. Point 3 is the demand for purity. Oh boy, I got all kinds on this one.
Same
Okay.
here, man.
Yeah, this is a big one because this is where the
Yeah.
guilt comes in.
Yep.
Lifton says, quote, "The demand for purity is a call for radical separation of good and evil within the environment and within oneself. Purification is a continuing process, often institutionalized in the cult of confession, which enforces conformity through guilt and shame evoked by mutual criticism and self-criticism in small groups," end quote. And then you wrote here, the demand for purity is a bifurcated, is that how you say that word?
Bifurcated. Yeah.
Bifurcated,
A black
yes.
and white sort of a system.
Great. So the demand for purity is a bifurcated approach to all of life, sharply dividing the experiential world into the pure and the impure, into the absolutely good and the absolutely evil. All taints and poisons which contribute to the existing state of impurity must be searched out and eliminated. And that was a quote there also from Lifton. So this essentially describes a Manichaean worldview, a black and white polarity. This is where the black and white thinking comes in, right? We kind of dumb this down to black and white thinking. But there's more going on. The idea is that absolute purity is attainable, whatever the group or leaders describe as the goal, and that anything done to anyone in the name of this purity is ultimately moral. And that is a really, really crucial point, because one of the things that cults do is they modify your morality. And they do that by modifying and changing or altering your ideas of what's good and what's bad. Because that's really, at the end of the day, what morality is. It's your idea of what
Mm-hmm.
is good and what's bad. So if you control the value system on which people make these decisions, then you control their morality. You control the decisions they will make on a day-to-day basis based on what they think is good and bad. And it specifically, you write here, effect on the individual. On the level of the relationship between the person and the environment, Lifton indicates that, quote, the demand for purity creates what we may term a guilty milieu and a shaming milieu. Since each man's impurities are deemed sinful and potentially harmful to himself and others, he is, so to speak, expected to receive punishment, which results in a relationship of guilt with his environment, end quote. Moreover, the individual will likely not be able to measure up to the standards laid out by the group or leader, thus reinforcing shame and guilt upon one's inevitable failure. It
Mm-hmm.
seems to me almost obvious how this is applied in an evangelical or religious, Christian religious milieu, but
Is it
what
that
was your...
easy?
Yeah, well, it's just so, yeah, it's everybody knows, but
Yeah.
specifically, what was your experience with this?
Well, we even use the word, part of the word of a description is the purity culture. That's a thing in evangelicalism, the evangelical purity culture. If you go online and search purity culture, you're going to find all kinds of stuff, and it's all around sexual purity. But the model is exactly as Lifton describes it. You're telling kids that grow up in a Christian home that they have to be sexually pure, and that's the standard. That's that unattainable standard. They of course cannot achieve that because they're teenagers, man. They're burning with raging hormones. So they have to suppress and they have to confess it. Some churches go to the point of like, they have these purity rings that kids wear and they sign purity pledges. I will remain a virgin until my wedding night. And between me and God and my parents and the whole church. And when that kid inevitably fails, either by getting into pornography or having sex of some kind, masturbation, whatever the act may be, then there's the guilt, there's the shame. And according to Lifton, that's when you can control people by manipulating those levers of guilt and shame. And then you can put the accountability group piece in there too, because that's where evangelicals gather to confess their sins to one another, and that's where you get into this whole cult of confession, which is the next point. But yeah, it's amazing in evangelicalism. The purity culture is so damaging, unbelievably damaging to so many people. I was a victim of it growing up, and it's messed me up in so many ways that I've unpacked over the years, that I'm seeing how damaging it was sexually, psychologically, relationally, and on and on.
It's very true. And of course, the reason why it becomes damaging, or one of the key reasons, is because you are fighting your biology.
Exactly. The
And
powerful drives. You're trying
the
to
most,
suppress the most powerful drive.
yeah,
And
exactly,
being
the
told
most.
God's gonna help you to suppress it. That's the mind fuck part of it. Is you're told as a kid you can't have sex, you can't masturbate, you can't look at pornography, you can't do this, that. So you can't stop yourself from doing all those things. And you go to God and you beg and plead, God, I need you to help me stop, because this is obviously terrible activity. It's sinful, and I feel that guilt and the shame, and He doesn't help you. And then you're in this shame spiral, and it's vicious. It's utterly vicious. And I can remember going through that when I was a teenager, just begging God to help me stop, masturbating, and He wouldn't. No, I couldn't stop, and every kid's not able to stop. And I was a
I,
normal kid. I certainly didn't know that. I wasn't normal then.
in my entire life, there is only one man I've ever met who I was sure didn't masturbate. He just didn't. It just wasn't a thing for him.
Wasn't a thing.
This was a guy in Scientology, and he was raised in Scientology, raised in the Sea organization, in fact,
Mm,
and he just kind of was a very unique guy. And I only
mm,
bring this up because I want to point out what a brilliant control mechanism this is, to use sex. Now, this demand for purity is not just about sex, and I'll give you an example in a second of how this was used in Scientology in a non-sexual way. Sex is absolutely used in Scientology to control, just like in Christianity. But I just want to point out the brilliance of this, that this goes back centuries and centuries. And the reason it's brilliant is because you know that every single person, I mean, you know, a very, very tiny percentage of people are not going to be consumed by their hormonal urges when they are teens and carrying on into the rest of their life. You know, our hormones are not a joke. They are the things that make our brain go bing and drive our action. This is how we think, and how we quote unquote think is the, you know, your body gets into certain conditions of, or certain, you know, gets things going a certain way. You get turned on, you know, you get into this mode, this affect of being sexually stimulated, and your entire body is built, literally built for this function. This is not a small part of what we do with our lives. This is everything about what we do with our lives, the sexual urge I'm talking about. Because this is procreation. This is survival of the species. This is spreading as many copies of your genes as you can to as many hosts as you can, because that's what biology is. So we've got a control mechanism here that slams right up against that and says, yes, you have these urges. They come from the devil. You know, in Scientology, it comes from your reactive mind or your traumatic incidents from the past. It's not natural to you as a spiritual entity to have sexual urges, so it's something different from you, is how it's positioned in Scientology, which is basically the same thing as what's done in Christianity. And you are told that you have to resist this. You have to fight this. But this is one of those things that's like fighting getting hungry. There is no fighting this. This isn't something you're going to fight. It's not meant to be fought. But by making it something that is adversarial, by creating an adversarial relationship with your own biology, you have created a psychosis. And that's really kind of, at the end of the day, what it comes down to is this, you know, you must have this thing, but you can't have this thing, but you must have this thing. You have to think about it. The urges come regardless of how many pure thoughts you're thinking or how many Bible scriptures you memorize. The biology is the biology, you know, and it's just going to keep coming at you. So it really creates this, like, it's this, like I said, it's a brilliant control mechanism because it's always going to be on, you know, and they're always...
You can't switch it off.
No.
You can suppress it. Well, I mean, look at the Catholic Church is probably the most extreme example, isn't it? Celibate priests and celibate nuns. They cannot have a family. They cannot have sex. They're not supposed to. But obviously, throughout millennia of the Catholic Church, it has always been an issue for priests and nuns. You know, I mean, you read these stories about the place in Ireland they found all these mass graves of babies that were buried by the Catholic Church. And I mean, where do these babies come from? Some think it was priests having sex with nuns, and you know, it's a thing, man. You know, or pedophile priests. I don't know. You know, so it's an issue for sure.
Absolutely it is. And trying to basically, of course, the point, and hardly an original point with us here in this podcast, but, you know, trying to suppress the, you know, biological urges is always going to be a recipe for disaster. You know, you simply must have an outlet. And the proof is in the pudding, as you just pointed out. Look at how many priests fail. Look at how many nuns fail, right, at this, and end up doing truly horrifying things with children, no less, because those are the only, you know, living bodies around them that they actually can manhandle and control and convince to, you know, let them whet their sexual appetites on them, because they can't go seduce a nun and get away with it. They can't go have an affair and get away with it. I'm sure many have, but those who don't think they can, well, then they end up turning to the children. And, of course, then you also have the just straight up people with pedophilic urges who also go into the priesthood. So it's a mess.
It's
And
a mess.
none of it is necessary. It is completely arbitrary. It's wholly
Exactly.
invented. It's insane.
Yeah.
Now, to point out another example of this demand for purity that comes down in the world of Scientology, I think that what I have talked at some length about regarding emotional suppression comes into play here.
Mm.
Purity of spirit in Scientology is reflected by this term "no case on post." As a Scientology staff member or as a member of their elite C organization, sort of their monastic order, you have a suppression or a repression of emotional responses to things. You're not supposed to be upset ever. You're not supposed to have emotional, reactions like anger, grief, fear, loss, trauma. You're not supposed to be, expressing or exhibiting signs of any of this when you're working, when you're on the job. And as a Sea Org member, you're on the job 24/7. So no case on post, it becomes this demand for purity where you are supposed to be this calm, rational, spiritual entity that is not being affected by or dragged down by those awful emotions that are coming from in Scientology, coming from your reactive mind or your past traumas and stressors. And you're supposed to maintain control over this. And as I've mentioned many times, for a limited degree of time, you can. But when it's 24/7, 365 days a year, when that is your life and that's the lifestyle you're supposed to be leading, it turns you into an automaton. You have no other choice because you can't experience healthy emotions, or you can't healthily experience your emotions the way people in the big wide world can and go through them and experience them. And that's how you get over traumas and losses and upsets, is you experience the emotions of it and you go through it, and
It's
eventually,
normal human emotions.
yeah,
That's the whole thing. And the
That's
beauty
right.
of this system, when we go into the next point, is that's what sets you up for the cult of confession. I heard Lifton say this on an interview. He said the beauty of the demand for purity, is that the leader of the group can set whatever standard they want, knowing it's unachievable, knowing it's unattainable. You won't be able to suppress your sexuality. You won't be able to suppress your normal human emotion. So you will fail, guaranteed 100%, which then opens the door for the confession and the manipulation and all the rest of it. So those 2 points really have to kind of go together. And obviously we're going to get there
Yes.
at some point. I'm enjoying this though. I don't know about you, but it's good.
No, absolutely. No, breaking it down like this is a way I've not particularly approached it from this perspective before. But and all of these are, all of these lead one into the next, as you pointed out at the beginning, because none of this is possible without milieu control. As an example, right? So
my dog just came
there
in.
he is. Hey, buddy.
Well, I'm here by myself, so that she had to come up and hang with Dad.
Not a problem at all.
Yep.
Okay, so let's get into this confession part, because this is the part that I think a lot of people see or are aware of, because it is so, out there and it's visible and noticeable. But keep in mind, folks, that this is built on the first 3 points we've gone over and the additional points we'll cover later. But this is a really, really key one. Creating guilt, shaming people. I mean, we see this broadcast all over social media now as a method of control. The cancel culture and all that. I mean, it's an ultimate expression of blame, shame, and regret, right? Trying to bring down people through these means. And within a cult group, it becomes even more, I guess I could say, extremified. Lifton says, quote, closely related to the demand for absolute purity is an obsession with personal confession. Confession is carried beyond its ordinary religious, legal, and therapeutic expressions to the point of becoming a cult in itself, end quote. So cult of confession. This may involve confession of crimes one hasn't committed, including thought crimes, and that is rife in Scientology, by the way. Sinfulness that is artificially induced, all in the name of an arbitrarily imposed cure, as we mentioned with the auditing and with confessions. The fact is, we are all susceptible to being manipulated through these emotional levers of guilt and shame. Lifton says that, quote, in totalist hands, confession becomes a means of exploiting rather than offering solace for these vulnerabilities, end quote. Very important point there. And in terms of psychological influence on a person, at the beginning, it is genuinely helpful to the individual in the sense that confession is genuinely emotionally cathartic. Absolutely no doubt about that. It helps rid one of suppressed feelings of guilt and thus brings an existential sense of psychological relief. Moreover, Lifton says, quote, the sharing of confession enthusiasms can create an orgiastic sense of oneness, of the most extreme intimacy with fellow confessors, and of the dissolution of self into the great flow of the movement, end quote. There's also the possibility of genuine self-revelation and self-betterment by the true exposure of what I am, quote unquote, as an individual. And this is even more so as your fellow members seem to accept you as you really are, quote unquote, as you bare your soul to them. However, over time, as an individual fails to live up to the demands for purity, he or she will continue to confess their sins and is therefore susceptible to being manipulated by the group or leader via the exploitation of one's guilt and shame mechanisms. Also, the group or leader is the only entity that one needs to overcome one's shortcomings. Thus, the thought of leaving the group and therefore the connection to wholeness or forgiveness is difficult to contemplate. Right. Okay. So, yeah. So, how did you experience this?
Well, as we were saying, the demand for purity, as he says, feeds into the cult of confession, because when you inevitably fail, the only cathartic method of solving that problem, the existential guilt and shame I'm feeling, is to confess it to God, to someone else, because the Bible says, confess your sins one to another. It's not enough for me to pray privately in my own room that I sinned and I need forgiveness for that. Somehow it's not enough. I've got to go approach another Christian or in my small group accountability group and confess my sins. And I think that starts to get into that dynamic that Lifton's describing, because they're opening themselves up too. We have this level of transparency, and it sets up this reciprocal kind of nature. The more I share, the more you share, the more I share, the more you share. But the problem is that within evangelicalism, a lot of times those things can end up getting used against you. It has happened to me. Things that I confessed that I was struggling with ended up being brought out later somewhere else, you know, and then I realized it wasn't a safe place. And I was vulnerable to being exploited by other people who knew my innermost secrets, you know, so it wasn't a safe place.
This is also one of the hardest things to overcome with people who are in destructive cults, who have fallen into this pattern because of the fact that confession is, at first, genuinely cathartic.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you have people who are truly experiencing some relief, emotional relief, psychological relief, however you want to word that or put that, but they do truly feel helped. And they truly, it's not an illusion that they feel closer to their fellow group members. They feel closer to the leader. They feel more actually in tune with their entire environment, their entire world, because there is a thing about getting sins off your chest.
Absolutely.
You know, because if you look at the morality of it and the in-group, out-group aspect of it, you know, when you're part of a group, any group, I don't care what group, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, you know, Satanists, heathens, whatever, Republicans, Democrats, if you know you've been doing things that are against the basic morality of the group, or you've been breaking some rules, cutting some corners, slacking off, doing whatever it is that you know you're not supposed to be doing, that you could be called out for or caught up for. and you confess that stuff, you now feel like that stuff is moved into the past, and with a new bright future, you can become a pure group member again. You can be accepted in the group. You can be, purely and fully what it is you're claiming to be, without the guilt or shame of, oh, but I fell short of those ideals a few times. I mean, I'm sure there's probably whole books written on the psychology of this, but, it makes a lot of sense from the point of view that you feel even more strongly part of your group after you have confessed. And this is why I say it's such a challenge to get people to be able to overcome that, because it is beneficial for the person in their eyes.
Absolutely.
And,
Well, I was going to say that it reminds me of the example of Fight Club, the beginning of the movie where the character, Edward Norton's character, he's just going to all these, AA meetings and NA meetings, and because he finds this incredible dynamic. People are bearing their souls in these group to strangers and getting hugs and acceptance and, love genuinely, it seems. And he becomes addicted to the meeting, because he says, I can't find this anywhere else, this dynamic. And it's the same kind of feeling. Like it is very cathartic, and it's very, liberating and freeing to, I mean, when I've done something against somebody else, I want to go to that person and make it right. And if I have to say, look, I did something wrong and I'm sorry, and I feel better when I've worked it out with that person, if I really care about them, and that's kind of that dynamic. I feel a weight's been lifted off my shoulders, and it wasn't physically there, but I felt bad that I knew I hurt someone else, and I don't want to rest until I've made it right.
Exactly. And that will take you to that'll take you so far, but the point, and as Lifton points out, that's the good part. That's the part that we're like, okay, we're cool, man, good.
Great.
But now when you have to start making things up, when you have to start coming up with thought crimes, because there are no physical crimes left to confess. And this happens in Scientology every day of the week. Where, because there are formal confessionals in Scientology. They're called confessionals. It's nothing like the Catholic Church. So forgive me for the word, except that's what Scientology calls it. They also call it security checking.
Sec check, isn't it? That's what they call it.
That's right. Yeah, Sec checks, right? Yeah. They called it integrity processing for a very brief period of time, but that didn't fly too well as a term. So they just kept up with security checking or sec checking. And that's in the world of Scientology, that's mostly what they call it. They don't say, did you go to a confessional or did you have a confessional? They say, did you get a sec check? And you get them at all levels. It is not concentrated at any one level of Scientology. So you're constantly being sec checked. And I know from personal experience and having talked to many, 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 many other Scientologists and former Christians and other groups as well, that this mechanism can itself become like we talked about earlier. It can become addictive. The elation, the euphoria can become addictive. This provides its own level of euphoria or elation, right? Because you feel this oneness that Lifton refers to. When he said that, the orgiastic sense of oneness, I knew I can remember what that feels like. Can you?
Yep, same here. Absolutely. In those accountability groups, we used to go to these pastoral summits every year at the Oregon coast, and it was like 50 or 100 pastors from all over the place. And that was their one chance to confess all their sins that they couldn't dare say to their congregations. I'm addicted to pornography, I'm having an affair, and whatever it was, and man, tears and everything else, sobbing and weeping, and people hugging and praying for each other. It was amazing, but that was the same feeling that we had in those pastoral, prayer summits and all that.
Yeah, it's a wonderful feeling, and you do reestablish that feeling of oneness with everybody else in the group, and so that can become addictive. That can become like you're chasing this ephemeral sort of will-o-wisp, and because that's what it becomes after a while. Because there is only so much oneness to be gained, and the fact is you are an individual. You're not one with everybody else. That's a sensation you experience, but it's just a sensation. There isn't some spiritual envelopment that occurs there, and so you start becoming desperate for that, and that can become very, very problematic from a long-term psychological point of view, especially when you have to start making things up.
Exactly. I was going to say that we were talking about the supposedly positive side, which it does have, as you say.
Yep.
It's when you start getting into when someone's reporting on you, when you've done something, or you maybe you didn't do anything, you get reported on by someone else, and then you've got to confess, or like you say, it goes around the circle and you haven't done anything. You've got to start thinking, I had a bad thought, I thought some bad things. Because even in the Bible, Jesus says, if you look upon a woman lustfully in your heart, it's just the same as if you actually physically had sex. So he sets up that standard. That becomes a thought crime. If I'm attracted to someone other than my spouse, and I think I want to have sex with that, apparently that's a thought crime according to Jesus. That is now something I got to confess. And the most extreme examples, I knew a woman in our church who was part of a very cultic fundamentalist church, and they used to put people up literally on a chair around, and everyone else would gather around the circle and basically hurl accusations at them in an attempt to break them down to where they can start confessing everything. And that was in a church in Portland, and that happens. I've heard of that happening in other churches as well, so it can be very ugly.
It gets really bad. And in Scientology, as an example, you can get to the thought crime aspect of Scientology is interesting, because what Hubbard says is that the bad thoughts or critical thoughts, if you are critical, if you have criticism of another individual or the group, and especially if you're criticizing Hubbard, Scientology, nowadays David Miscavige, then that indicates that there is some actual physical act or lack of act, an omission, something you should have done that you didn't do, which is just as bad in Scientology. You have omission and you have commission, acts of commission, and you have acts of omission. I should have pulled the kid away from the burning fire, and I didn't. I had the opportunity, I had the means, and I didn't. So that itself can be a bad thing too, of course. So if you are critical in Scientology of the organization or of Scientologists or anything like that, then what the standard response in a Scientology sect check is, okay, so you're sitting here complaining to me about your boss and how you haven't gotten a raise and how you've been working for 3 years and no raises, and and he comes along and rags on your work every day, and it's all so horrible. What did you do that the boss doesn't know about? Right? Have you done something? Yeah. Have you done something? Is there something that the boss nearly found out? Is there something you did that the boss should know? Like they'll vary the question. There's 50 ways you can ask that question, but they're going to get from you something you did.
Oh, you've done something. You stole a pencil or something.
That's right. You played solitaire that time. You you wasted 5 minutes of over lunchtime or whatever. Whatever the bullshit answer you're going to come up with. This is how it's done in Scientology, and you do. If you buy into that as a concept, that because you're critical, you have what's called in Scientology a sin. If you have an overt act, if you've done something, once you buy into that, you've got to come up with an answer. There's no way you're walking out of that sect check without answering that question in the affirmative and laying out what you did. So this becomes a thing where you have to start making up answers, and there were tons and tons of times that happened to me. It becomes easier when it becomes easier in Scientology when you're down the track in your past lives and you're making shit up that you did 20 million years ago. That's a lot easier. The this lifetime stuff was always the challenging part of it, When you're faced with what can seem like a daunting task of fact-checking, or even just reading or listening to news or information, it seems like there's a near infinite amount of stuff you have to plow through. It's hard to know what's accurate or factual, even if a story or article seems believable. That's why you need resources like the Great Courses Plus to give you in-depth content you can trust. I do. I love what this streaming service offers. Thousands of objective, unbiased lectures from respected professors who really do know their stuff. You get courses on topics as wide-ranging as human behavior, to science fiction, to philosophy, to even learning how to play musical instruments or writing. And with the Great Courses Plus app, you can even learn on the go no matter where you are. This month, I highly recommend you check out Argumentation, the Study of Effective Reasoning. Now, this is a course that is right up my alley, and I'm sure it will be up yours too. I mean, if you understand the component parts of what makes a good argument, what strong reasoning is versus weak reasoning, and how to use this in your day-to-day life, you're gonna almost instantly be able to see the flaws or problems in news reports, magazines, and even from your friends on social media. Stop wondering what is true and actually take some easy steps to learn for yourself. Sign up for the Great Courses Plus today. I've arranged for my listeners to get a full month of unlimited access for free. To get your free month, sign up today using my special URL, which is in the description section of this podcast and is shown on the screen right here. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/critical. Remember, thegreatcoursesplus.com/critical. Sign up today. But you also do have an alienation factor here, because as far as control mechanisms go, it's not all just in your head. This is something that is used, as you pointed out. You stick somebody up on a chair, you start throwing, hurling accusations at them. This is, what, because it becomes a thing of, well, what? You don't have any sins?
There must be
You're
something.
Perfect?
Yeah.
You didn't
They're
do
gonna find
anything?
something.
Yeah, And it's like you
Yeah.
actually can live a life where, I'm really cool. If you you can have that, but we're all so bought into this idea that there's some evil beast living at the heart of us that we must be full of all of this horrible sin, and that of course calls back to milieu control and the whole indoctrination thing that you're buying into in the first place. So.
Yep, absolutely. Well, and you can see the progression as as I said before. The articles that I read talked about first is the propaganda, then the indoctrination. So the propaganda is the milieu control, the mystical manipulation. Those are the things that draw people in to the group. But then when you get plugged in and really become a faithful member of a church or a Scientologist, that's when they really start putting their hooks into you. The demand for purity, the cult of confession, and you can see how you're led down that line, and you're more and more controllable, and you're more and more controlled by the group. And this is the progression.
Exactly right. Nailing it there. And I hope people can see and start differentiating from what we're talking about here: high control, authoritarian, totalist groups versus groups that have some standards, groups that have some rules and some guidelines, because these are night and day differences. I mean, we're really trying to show that, this business of dialing it up to 11 is still very, very important to understanding this whole process. It's not just because you go to confession that you're in a destructive cult. And anybody who's walking away from, is just not hearing what we're saying here. If anybody's getting that message, that's not the point. The point is, how much is this mechanism used to control your existence, to control your thinking, and your loyalty, and your money.
Yeah, and it's doing psychological damage. That's what I
Right.
appreciate about what Lifton, with every one of these markers, he says there's an effect on the person psychologically and maybe physically.
That's
That's
right.
a critical point, because you could be in the most seemingly benign church or religion or whatever, but these tactics are being used. They are doing something to you psychologically. It's attacking your identity. You're cutting yourself off from the outside world. Isolation is one of the critical things, isn't it, of how cults control people. They slowly begin to wall them off from their friends and family and the outside world. You're in the bubble, and you're no longer the person. You're almost unrecognizable to your old friends and family. You become a raving, fundamentalist or a Scientologist or a Mooney or whatever group you want to join. This is how they do it.
That's right. This is exactly how they do it. And I hope we can start also seeing here how this leads to, or can lead to, outright criminal behavior on the part of cult
Oh,
members
absolutely.
who buy into this, right?
I mean, look
Um,
at Om Shinrikyo, one of the classic examples. They released sarin gas on the subways in Tokyo, commanded by their leader, because it was going to bring about Armageddon and the end of the world. That's what they believed. They went and killed people, and wounded hundreds, maybe thousands of others as they breathed sarin gas in on the subways in Tokyo. And these were normal people that were indoctrinated over a period of years to the point where they're releasing sarin gas on a subway.
exactly. Do you think any
You
of them
know?
walked in on day one and said, "That's what I
Yeah,
want. I'm all about that"?
yeah. I'm here for the
No.
sarin gas. Where do I
Yeah.
pick up the?
Exactly. I came for the sarin gas and stayed for
Yeah,
the big fat hulking Japanese guy who's telling me how to
yeah,
live my life.
exactly. Anyway,
All right. Well, sacred science is our next point. Let's tackle this one. Quote,
mm,
sacred science is important because a claim of being scientific is often needed to gain plausibility and influence in the modern age. End quote. In his book, Lifton further explains, quote, the totalist milieu maintains an aura of sacredness around its basic dogma, holding it out as an ultimate moral vision for the ordering of human existence. End quote. Examples: an inerrant Bible, teachings of L. Ron Hubbard, the Book of Mormon, or other of Smith's teachings, or the JWs and the New World Translation, etc. So, sacred science. In terms of effect on the individual, Lifton says, quote, the totalist sacred science can offer much comfort and security. Its appeal lies in its seeming unification of the mystical and the logical modes of experience, end quote. However, there's a downside to this whole thing, too. Quote, but the posture of unquestioning faith, both rationally and non-rationally derived, is not easy to sustain, especially if one discovers that the world of experience is not nearly as absolute as the sacred science claims it to be, end quote. Of
mm.
course, the first thing I think of is flat earthers as the most,
Yeah.
extreme example of this kind of nonsense. It's very hard to, it's not easy to maintain. It's not easy to keep it
Mm.
going because and these guys are being hit constantly by, facts and evidence and reason and people
Science,
telling them, yeah, real science. But
satellites.
but when you have sacred science, and maybe the flat earthers are not a bad example here,
Mm.
there's this aura of sacredness around its basic dogma, that holds out as an ultimate moral vision of the ordering of human existence. If your basic dogma is that there's some deep state worldwide conspiracy to control you, and you've bought into that as a basic premise,
Hmm.
you can justify any belief. You can make anything make sense
Hmm.
once you've bought into that basic dogmatic worldview. And that's where flat earthers live. One to
Yeah.
one to one. That's where they live. They have bought into this worldwide international conspiracy against them as an individual and their own individual rights and freedoms. And they view the entire world through that lens. So when you're trying to talk science to them, you're
Yeah.
five
Forget
levels
it.
way above where they're at. They're hunkered down in this dogmatic position. And until
Yeah.
you deal with that, you're never going to get a fact about, science across to them. What was how did this play out in your world?
Well, that's why I put the inerrant Bible in that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was just curious how it played out.
Yeah. Oh man. I
Was
mean,
it literal interpretation? Was it literal Bible interpretation?
it was a literalist
Mm-hmm.
interpretation, which is a little bit of a nuance, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
because evangelicals, you can't interpret the Bible literally, because like in the book of Psalms, it says God is a rock. It says God is like a shield and a sword. I mean, these are metaphors. Obviously you can't, you know what I mean? You can't, he's not a rock. He's not a shield. He's not, you know what I mean? So they understand there's figures of speech and similes and metaphors. So, but having said all that, it's a very literalist interpretation. So they believe that all the words of the Bible are inspired of God. There's no mistakes anywhere, ever. And therefore, that's the sacred science, is that it allows them to hold it up and say, because of the fact that it's inspired and inerrant and infallible, therefore it's authoritative as well. And therefore, for all standards of faith and practice, the Bible is our guide. And then the question becomes, well, who, according to whose interpretation? you know, well, mine. I'm the one who's in control right now. I'm standing up in front preaching, so you better listen to me, because I studied Greek and Hebrew and I can figure it all out, or whatever your qualifications are.
Interesting. Interesting. Were was your faith a young earth creationist faith?
I believed I was a creationist, but I wasn't sure about the young earth part. I was raised to believe that was true. I was taught that as a kid. I went to Christian school from 5th grade on, and that was just a matter of course. That was, of course, the world is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. But I was always struggling with these scientific facts. Every time I would be confronted with these, carbon dating of rocks and things, saying they're billions of years old, or fossils, oh, that can't be true. I saw Ken Ham's film on this, and it's,
So you had a fallback position to deny
Yeah.
science because you had this basic dogma in place.
But I was never hardcore about it. I was always open to the idea of, well, what if the Bible isn't scientifically provable? But it becomes that house of cards where for the Christian who goes down that line, they're going to struggle, because, as I've said before, that's my analogy. You take 1 or 2 cards out, the whole thing comes crashing down. So they can't afford to have even one card, one plank in their platform cannot be allowed. It has to be defended at all costs. That's the Ken Ham position. There's a plaque in his Ark exhibit that says something like, if you deny the literal flood in the first few chapters of Genesis, then you won't believe in the resurrection and the virgin birth and the deity of Christ and all that either. So you can see how he's linked the first couple chapters of the Bible to all the rest of the important bits of Christian doctrine. It's all important. He can't afford to allow any cracks in there.
That is very interesting, and I find it, extremely manipulative, because it's not logically consistent that just because the New Testament is true, that the Old Testament has to be true.
And every word has to be true. Historically, scientifically, geographically, blah, blah, blah. That's why he built the fucking Ark in Kentucky. So you can go there and go, okay, so this is what it must have looked like. Literally, Noah's Ark. It's right there. You can go see it. It must have happened. It must be true, because they followed the dimensions in the Bible. That's how they built it. Even though they had modern cranes, and it still took him, 4 or 5 years with all the modern equipment that we have today that Noah wouldn't have had in a Stone Age or whatever. So there's a glaring, irony in the whole building of Ken Ham's Ark anyway.
Well, exactly. And this is where it becomes not easy to sustain, but somehow these folks can do it.
He did it. He's doing it.
I have to comment on this because my experience was the exact opposite of yours, but still a sacred science. And I was constantly struggling to sustain it. And the reason why is because we were exposed to and given free access to encyclopedias and knowledge, and told, clear your misunderstood words. If you're reading something Hubbard's talking about and you don't understand it, you got to go clear it up. And so he was using physics and engineering and science and electronics terms, and I actually learned quite a bit about electronics and certain engineering principles as a Scientologist. But I was always able to, apply motivated reasoning to it to make it make sense within the construct that Hubbard had created, where he said that rather than the universe being a very young age, which directly contradicts all of science, instead Hubbard extended the age of the universe by billions and trillions of years. Literally quadrillions of years in an ultimate sense, which I found out after I got out of Scientology. He said that our first entry into the MEST, or physical universe, matter, energy, space, time, MEST, MEST is what they call it in Scientology, Our entry into this universe, into this mode of existence of matter, energy, space, and time occurred 4 quadrillion years ago.
Hmm.
And one of his early rationalizations for this in the 50s, when he was talking to his very uneducated, scientifically uneducated or illiterate audiences, was that carbon dating was off. It was a perfectly fine procedure,
Right.
but they had misguessed how much carbon actually existed in the universe at the beginning. So their half-life dating process was all off, and the dates were all wrong, and this universe was much, much older, and this planet was much, much older than Earth science was allowing for. So
That's hilarious. So
oh
here
yeah,
I am. I'm the Earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and you're saying no,
yes,
it's actually older than what science says it is. We have the exact opposite problem here.
that's
Oh,
right,
that is
that's
so
right. And
funny.
the time spans also, interestingly enough, Hubbard actually got away with changing the time periods over the years too, because in the early 50s he was saying that we as spiritual entities or thetans are 76 trillion years old. That was a number that always stuck with me. 76 trillion years old. That's how old we are. The 4 quadrillion thing came significantly later in the 60s, right, with the whole Xenu story. So yeah, sacred science. Excuse me. It is rife through Scientology. The e-meter is an electronic machine. It's a device, and it's got a little needle on it that bounces around when you put somebody on the cans. Well, that's science. Science, bitches. It's a machine, right? It must be scientific.
Must be
I mean,
true.
this, all kinds of nonsense like that, rife throughout Scientology. So, okay, let's go to the next one.
I was just going to point out before we
Oh,
go
yes.
on
Yeah.
the thing about what Lifton says about it's got to have credibility in our modern age. That's the one thing about evangelicals and fundamentalists with the Bible, because it's such an ancient book, and because it's not, they have. That's why guys like Ken Ham are so rabid about defending creationism scientifically, because they have to prove that the Bible is actually scientifically verifiable. You know what I mean? To make it, because it's sacred science. If they were to admit that the Bible had it wrong when it came to science, well, then according to Ken Ham, all the rest of it falls apart. So that's why they're on this crusade. That's why you have Christian scientists who are so desperate to prove that it's also, the Creation Museum and all these other places. That's exactly what's going on. They're trying to prove it as a scientific book, to make it verifiable and everything from a faith point of view.
Well, they really overplayed their hand early on, and then they got challenged by science in the more modern era, because I think scientific pushback, well, I don't know when it began, but it has certainly been a crusade on the part of science for as long as I've been around. And and I was born in '69, so I Carl Sagan pushing back on this stuff early on, and then of course many others following. And I don't know that they were really, I don't know that Ken Ham's upbringing was full of that. I think he got blindsided at some point. I think a bunch of these guys did. And they went, oh, wait a second. Well, we've been saying all this stuff, and now we've painted ourselves into a corner, and we have to have this stuff be true, that that Genesis had to have happened in 6 days.
Yeah,
literal
24-hour days.
Well, except that they move the goalposts, and they say, oh no, a day is actually 1 billion years. Right, I've seen this. You get different schools of this, and of course, intelligent design comes out of this, and just these guys are just wrapping themselves in pretzels, trying to rationalize these dogmatic beliefs. And it's laughable how bad and how far out of the way they have to go, and how many goalposts they have to move. I mean, they have to create whole new fields. It's not even like moving the goalpost 10 or 5 or 10 yards. They're off in Poughkeepsie at this point. They took a wrong turn at Albuquerque. So it's kind of it's kind of funny to watch it happen,
Mm,
because they can't. But it's all based on that original dogmatic belief, and
exactly.
until you and engaging with these people, where everybody misses is they're engaging up here. They're engaging at the level of the facts, and we're going to have a fact-to-fact argument, and they're missing that it's built on a bedrock of dogmatic, faith-based belief that cannot be assaulted. And if
Mm,
you can't
yeah,
somehow spring that, and pop that, all the rest of it goes nowhere. And that's
yeah,
probably one reason why I'm not so keen personally to get into the debate world and debate Christians and theologians and stuff and really get into all of this, because those things don't tend to get to the bedrock level of what's really being debated. They're all about this stuff up here,
mm,
how fast does the earth spin, and what's a day really mean, and the cosmic clock,
mm,
and all this other stuff that's not where these guys are coming from,
mm,
the cultists. So
yeah,
anyway, just thought I'd comment on that.
yeah.
Now, this next one is a powerful one. I've spent a lot of time talking about this one, and this is loading the language,
Mm,
loaded language, or thought terminating cliches. I've done whole videos on this stuff, right? Literalism, tendency to deify words or images. A simplified, cliche ridden language can exert enormous psychological force, reducing every issue in a complicated life to a single set of slogans that are said to embody the truth as a totality. Okay, that's the Lifton quote there. Lifton expands by saying, quote, the language of the totalist environment is characterized by the thought-terminating cliche. The most far-reaching and complex of human problems are compressed into brief, highly reductive, definitive-sounding phrases, easily memorized and easily expressed. They become the start and finish of any ideological analysis. Okay, so psychologically now, quote, the effect of the language of ideological totalism can be summed up in one word: constriction. He is, so to speak, linguistically deprived, and since language is so central to all human experience, his capacities for thinking and feeling are immensely narrowed. The person may not feel chained, but is nonetheless, in effect, confined and bound up by those verbal fetters.
mm.
All right, I'm curious about what sort of thought-stopping cliches you experienced.
Now I was gonna say we don't have any in Christianity, Chris.
Oh,
They
okay.
just don't exist. Everything else, we're 7 out of 8. We don't have.
Of course.
No,
Of
I'm
course.
sorry to say we have thought terminating cliches. We have loaded language. It's called Christianese. That's the term for it, and it's platitudes that Christians use all the time. I'm sure you've got millions of examples in Scientology. Simple platitudes. Oh, God is in control. All things work together for the good to those who love God. They can be Bible verses. That one I just quoted is a Bible verse out of Romans 8:28. Classic. Everyone just says, "Oh, my mother's dying of cancer." Well, all things work together for good for those who love God, and that's supposed to solve all the problems. You know, um, let go and let God. I mean, there's so many Christianese platitudes. Jesus take the wheel, and on and on and on and on. That you just say them without thinking, and you don't have to think. It's like you say, it's designed as a thought terminating cliche rather than me really facing the problem. My mom having cancer. Oh, God's in control. Yeah, God has a plan. We
That's
don't
right.
know what that plan is now, but we'll someday, maybe in heaven, we'll understand. Okay, what the hell? What does that even mean? I need answers now. Nope, you're going to wait till heaven until you get some answers. And that's supposed to solve your problem? That's the cliche. That's the loaded language.
And it never really does solve the problem, does it? It just sort of
No,
pushes it, kicks the can down the road.
it
It's really all it
suppresses
does.
yeah. I think it's a case of we all feel the cognitive dissonance, and so we have to do something to push that down. And thought terminating cliches, I think, are one of the best ways to do that, or it'll quell the dissonance that we're feeling by spouting some platitudes or praying and chanting in tongues or something like that. That's another thought. I don't have to think if I'm praying or if I'm speaking in tongues or, those kind of things, because I can override my fears and doubts by chanting or praying or singing or whatever.
Exactly. I've said faith are the thoughts that you don't have to think about anymore. You
That's
know,
a good way to say it.
yeah, because you don't have to think about it. And the thought-stopping cliches are rife in these cults, and they are very comforting because exactly for the reason you just mentioned. I was going to bring this up. I'm really, really glad you brought it up, because it settles your cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
And cognitive dissonance is the phenomena, the dissonance, the noise that you experience in your head, and the energy that it takes to process the thinking that goes on when this happens, because it can be exhausting when you're faced with two contradictory thoughts or ideas or beliefs. You are faced with the real world reality of, you're about to lose your best friend, or your best friend is speaking out against the church. Right. And there he is, and he's going on and on at a mad rate about this. And you're sitting there going, oh, my God, this is my best friend. I love this guy. I can't believe he's saying these things. And you need to resolve all the noise that's going on in your head right now, because this guy's saying stuff that is challenging your beliefs. He's challenging he's at the, maybe he's attacking that base level, or maybe he's attacking some of the higher concepts of the religion, but he's coming at you. Or cult, whatever it is. We talk about this in religious terms all the time, but it doesn't have to be religious. It can be any subject matter. But here's this guy, and he's coming at you with this, and you're now challenged by this, and you have to deal with it. And you don't know what to say. You don't have rational arguments to kick back at this guy for what he's saying to you right now. So, boing, out comes the thought-stopping cliche. In Scientology, he's an SP. He's a suppressive person.
Yep.
Right, or he's connected to a suppressive person. You don't want to label him as a complete enemy yet, because he's your best friend. So instead, you say, he's PTS. He's a potential trouble source, PTS. And a potential trouble source is somebody who has had a suppressive person, a bad guy, a psycho, in his ear, telling him all the bad things about Scientology, and now he's spewing them at you. And you're not able to deal with it, and you don't want to deal with it, and you sure as hell don't want to process any of the stuff this guy's telling you, about abused kids, pedophilia in the church being covered up, or, financial crimes, or people's lives ruined, or families separated. That's not your experience of Scientology. You don't want to hear any of that. So you just put the brakes on, and up come the thought-stopping cliches. And the biggest, most powerful one in that case would be, he's PTS. And because he's PTS, I don't have to listen to a word he's saying. They are all lies. They are all lies, right?
Your example of the flat earther. If you start bringing science in, they're going to say, well, Chris, you're one of them.
Right.
You're one of them, man. Of course, why would I listen to you? You're going to say all these scientific quote unquote things that are all, you're part of the system, man. I'm not going to listen to you.
That's exactly right. Here's another thing that happens in Scientology on this same different, but on the same line of this that Lifton mentions, which is the capacity for thinking and feeling are immensely narrowed. And I wanted to highlight this because I think this is even more damaging. The cognitive dissonance shielding and the resistance to other ideas is definitely key in the loaded language, but also is the psychological shaping of how you think, what you're allowed to think. And language is powerful for this. This is Orwell spent practically half his life talking about this. The shaping of words and the definitions of words are key to shaping how and what you think. If you start in Scientology, for example, there are many, many specialized terms that sound semi-scientific. They're all pseudoscientific, like an engram. Okay, let's go with this one, right? This moment of pain and unconsciousness that you have experienced in your life. You get, you hit your thumb with a hammer, and you're unconscious for a microsecond, and there's a lot of pain, and there's blood, and it's really bad. And that moment in time will be called an engram, and it's stored supposedly in a part of your mind that you don't have ready access to. And because this engram exists, you are told in Scientology, you are going to behave and act in certain ways defined by the circumstances of that engram. And the goal of Scientology is to go and get rid of those engrams. It's actually Dianetics, but I won't mince,
Yeah.
I won't get that minutia right now. So once you accept that that's a thing, and by the way, there is zero evidence that engrams exist. There is zero evidence that a reactive mind exists to store them. This is all constructs that L. Ron Hubbard created in 1950.
That's sacred science, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's all part of sacred science.
That's right. And the language, he had to have a term for it, because there is no word for it, because it's made up. So we're going to call it an engram. But here's the thing. Once you buy into that as a true, real thing, then you start filtering all of your experiences through these engrams. Oh, well, the reason he's doing blah isn't because he's got a valid criticism of my movement or whatever it is, right? The reason he's doing X isn't why he says he's doing X. It's because he's got engrams. And
That's
I know.
problem.
Yeah, it's engrams. And he's just he doesn't know it. He's ignorant. He doesn't see it. He doesn't know what I know, right? So it gives, so there's all kinds of benefits here, because you get the status in your own mind. You get the status of knowing more than this guy does, understanding his behavior at a level he doesn't, and knowing why you can invalidate or ignore anything the guy has to say contrary to that, because you know and he doesn't. And this, so it reinforces, it creates and reinforces us versus them, black and white thinking. I mean, this is how it gets done. And I just wanted to highlight that, because I thought it was important to this. And I'm curious, did you have any kind of similar experiences or see anything like that in your past?
Yeah, that's a really good example, and it made me think of what in Christianity, this issue of what we call spiritual blindness. So it is exactly the same scenario you just described, except we would have ascribed it to me as a Christian trying to witness to a non-believer. Okay, and I'm trying to get through to them. I'm trying to preach the gospel, and I'm bringing out Bible verses, and I'm hitting them with everything, and it's not making a dent. I would say to myself, well, the reason I'm not getting through to this person with the good news of the gospel is because he or she is spiritually blind. They're being blinded by the devil. Satan has blinded their minds. And that's actually a biblical concept. Paul says that the God of this age has blinded the minds of the Jews, the non-believers, so that they cannot see the truth. That's a biblical concept. So we take that and go right on into the same exact scenario. That's your real problem. It's not that you're resisting my brilliant logic and persuasion. It's that you're spiritually blind. Satan has blinded you. And I need to pray that God will, open your eyes, spiritually, so you can see or hear the truth. It's exactly the same dynamic.
Brilliant. Yeah. And that us versus them thing, that is for real. And that's,
Oh, yeah.
and when you're in a group, I mean, I really can't stress this enough, man. When you're in a group of people who have all bought into this, the amount of power that is generated, psychological power, and peer pressure and all the rest to keep these beliefs, to hold on to these beliefs, to reinforce these beliefs. You get all kinds of positive affirmations from people around you that what you're saying and thinking is real and true, and this is how it is. And, so this is why it is so difficult to break through those. Mm-hmm. And the longer a person's exposed to this kind of behavior and milieu control and language control like this, the harder and harder it is to get them to consider an alternative point of view. And the language itself fights you. The language in their head fights your efforts to get them to see beyond that language, because they've defined their entire worldview by these specialized words. And this is also why, by the way, trying to learn all about the dogma of the religion or group or cult that you're trying to fight the person over, and then you're going to debate them over that,
Mhm.
That's why that shit never works, because they know it 10 times better than you're ever going to
Yeah,
know it, or they think they do,
that's
you
actually.
know?
Or maybe they're
So,
spiritually blind, Chris. That
yeah. Or it could be that I'm full of shit and I'm just spiritually blind. It's entirely possible.
that's probably true.
That's probably what it is. Okay. Well,
Yeah, that's probably it.
that's probably it. All right. Well, we got two more points here, and I've been having a lot of fun with this. I hope you guys are too. Okay. Point 7 is doctrine over person. Lifton comments,
Mm.
quote, "The principle of doctrine over person is invoked when cult members sense a conflict between what they are experiencing and what dogma says they should experience. The internalized message of the totalistic environment is that one must negate that personal experience on behalf of the truth of the dogma. Contradictions become associated with guilt. Doubt indicates one's own deficiency or evil." End quote. In his book, he says that doctrine over person is the subordination of human experience to the claims of doctrine. Okay, now, clearly, I'm sure anybody you can get like, oh my God, this is crazy, because this is kind of akin to gaslighting in a way.
Mhm.
Here's the effect on the individual psychologically. What happens to the person, quote, "who finds himself under such doctrine-dominated pressure to change is thrust into an intense struggle with his own sense of integrity, a struggle which takes place in relation to polarized feelings of sincerity and insincerity. In a totalist environment, absolute sincerity is demanded, and the major criterion for sincerity is likely to be one's degree of doctrinal compliance, both in regard to belief and to direction of personal change." End quote. One might, however, retain an alternative view of reality, but it depends on such things as, 1, how strong your previous identity is, 2, like your pre-cult identity,
Yeah.
2, the degree of penetration of the milieu by outside ideas, and 3, how much capacity one has retained for eventual individual renewal, right? How much you're holding on to your original self.
Mhm.
Because we have to, of course, comment here on the fact that if we haven't made it clear yet, um, joining a destructive cult changes your personality.
Yeah,
It
it does.
changes your language, it changes your worldview, it changes who you want to be, it changes your moral values, it changes what you think are as important as and unimportant, what is priority and what is not. And doctrine over person is the key component here for much of that, because it says that this dogma, this rule, L. Ron Hubbard, God, Jesus, whatever, Buddha, Deepak Chopra, Donald Trump, whoever the cult leader is, that what they're saying, what they're putting out, trumps you and your ideas
Mhm.
100% of the time. How did you
Yeah.
experience this?
Oh, absolutely. And I
Yeah.
was going to comment that this
Yeah.
is something Lifton talks about, this concept of what he calls doubling. And that is where you have your sort of pre-cult or pre-religious identity. And then when you join the religion, let's say a person who comes in later in life who wasn't born into it, they had a pre-cult identity or pre-religion identity. Then they kind of create a second self, the religious self, the one that fits in to the group. And you've got to start believing all the dogma, the sacred science, and you're being controlled by the milieu and everything else. And there's that sense of integrity that he talks about. It violates your own sense of integrity. You yourself wouldn't necessarily believe, you wouldn't, like a Christian, to say, well, God seems like an awful monster commanding genocide in the Old Testament and things like that, horrible laws in the Old Testament against women and homosexuals and things. But yet we love to worship the God of the New Testament, the sort of nicey God that everyone's singing. And every Sunday there's a bunch of people in church singing praises to the God who commanded genocide. And you ask people about that, you say, now wait a minute, you can't have this both ways, man. You can't worship a God that you claim is the same God of the Old and the New Testament, who did horrific, terrible things, who ordered his people to kill men, women, and children, and you're worshiping that God. You yourself aren't. You wouldn't be pro war crimes, would you? You don't think what the Nazis did was a good thing, do you? Of course not. Well, how can you worship a God who does that, who commands that? Well, that's when they go into the doubling, you know. Well, if I was God, I probably wouldn't do that, but his ways are higher than my ways, and I don't understand. And there's the loaded
And
language.
there's the thought-stopping cliche right there. His
Yep,
ways are not, are beyond me.
yep, they're inscrutable. Someday when we get to heaven, we'll get all the answers. We're right back in the loaded language.
That's
And
right.
Lifton says when he says it's loaded language, it means it's loaded with the dogma of that particular group. So in my case, the loading was the evangelical fundamentalist ideology. In your case, it was loaded with Scientology stuff. It's like a freight train. It's just loaded. The cars are all loaded with different dogmas. You got Scientology and I got fundamentalist Christianity.
That's right. And I hope we're showing how the mechanisms are the same, even if the
Yeah.
content and the words that are used, or even the language that's spoken, can be completely opposite, completely radically different. But the mechanisms are the same. And this is where this is really key to understand, because if you get this, it is really hard. It becomes much harder to fool you when you actually understand these little tricks, these 8 points, and
Yeah.
how these things work.
Well, I
Because
think I was going to say in Christianity, the biggest problem is when Christians encounter extreme suffering. That's when you really see them struggling in this doctrine over person thing. Because when a loved one gets cancer, let's say, they're angry at God for allowing this to happen. Why is this happening to me? Why is my 5-year-old son suffering in the hospital? I can't do anything about it. My prayers aren't having any effect. He's not being healed, and all the platitudes aren't working, the prayers aren't working, and God's not coming across for you. That's when but I shouldn't feel angry at God. I've got to repent of that. I've got, and that's the doctrine is saying something other than what I'm actually experiencing right now as I'm watching my child die in the hospital. And I don't understand why God isn't healing him and all the rest of it. And you have to suppress all the cognitive dissonance. So again, here comes the loaded language. God needed another angel in his choir, Chris. That's why he took your son home at 5 years old. But he lets Donald Trump live to,
right. Yeah,
why?
it gets to be
You
a bit
know?
rich.
Yeah.
In Scientology, it's always comes back to the mechanisms are all designed, or the language is all designed to come back and introvert you. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't think it's a whole lot different from other groups this way. But it's interesting how, for example, you're doubting something Hubbard is talking about. Okay, well, you're critical. What'd you do?
Mm,
What did you do that you think L. Ron Hubbard should know about?
mm.
What'd you do that you'd be ashamed to tell L. Ron Hubbard? That you're critical of L. Ron Hubbard, right? What'd you do, right?
Must be
Uh,
something you did.
that's right. It always comes back to you, right? And
Yeah.
and people seem to have we seem to be unfortunately psychologically built to have this endless well of guilt and shame about ourselves.
But that's what Lifton says.
You know,
That's why they use those two levers, because they are
that's right.
so easily manipulable. And that's
Exactly.
why it works in every cult, every religion. That's the cult of confession and the demand for purity and everything else, because it fucking works. So of course they use it.
That's right. And
It
the
works.
business here, by the way, of I'll tell you another example in Scientology that you're going to love. Um, in terms of in terms of self-policing and thought control, but also directly this doctrine over person thing. In Scientology, there is the concept of a postulate, a positive postulate, which is basically positive thinking or willing something,
Mm.
willing something into existence. And in Scientology, the basic concept is that all of this is something that is not real. It's all an illusion that we are all collectively creating, because we all agree that the physical universe is real, therefore it's real, therefore we live in it, we have bodies, etc. And in an ultimate sense, when you get to the top of Scientology's bridge to total freedom, then you're supposed to have stripped off all those agreements, and you'll be able to be involved in the physical universe or not at your own will. So sounds kind of nice, kind of godlike. But along the way, you try to practice postulating. It's an activity. It's something you do. You postulate something into existence. I want to win the lottery. I'm going to make a very strong postulate that I'm going to win the lottery, right?
Hmm.
And how this comes into play is if it doesn't come true, well, you just didn't make the postulate purely enough,
Right.
right?
It all comes back on you, doesn't it?
That's right. It was, but did you have any doubt? Because a postulate's supposed to be, intention without reservation. You intend, and there's no back off, no reservation, no doubt, no concept enters your mind that it's going to not happen. Because if it does, then guess what? That is also your postulate, and it defeats your original postulate, right? And Hubbard actually went way out of his way over the years to explain all of this in detail with, electric flows and all kinds of goofy mental mechanisms to explain why it is that, yes, Thetans create by postulates, but if your postulates aren't working, it's because they're not pure postulates. They're not, you express some sort of doubt or reservation. And the only way that you'll ever get above the need to do that, or basically be your own worst enemy, is to get up the bridge all the way to the very, very top. And this is how Scientology gets sold. Isn't it wonderful? It's this wonderful circular logic that enthralls Scientologists. And I had many conversations over the years as a Scientologist with other Scientologists about postulates and about why they do or don't work. And it's just another aspect of the mind control,
Well, something John Atack said, I had him on my podcast. In fact, I was going to say thank you because you kind of connected me with John. I know you've had him on your show multiple times, I think, but he said that one of the things you need to do when you get out of the cult or the religion is try to find a person who has never had any context of your faith, not religious at all, and explain to that person what you used to believe. And you watch the reaction, gauge the reaction on their face, and as they're shocked and amazed and stunned by as you're trying to explain to them what you used to believe, that reflects back on you. You think, my God, I used to believe this stuff. I mean, I've been doing all this research. I know we're going to be talking about Dominion theology, Bethel Redding Church in California. I mean, people of that church, they actually go lay on the graves of departed famous Christians around the world in an effort to soak up somehow the blessing from this departed saint. It'd be like me. I went to John Bonham's grave. Now I'm a drummer. I'm a rock and roll heavy metal drummer. I went to John Bonham's grave. Somehow I'm going to believe that, John Bonham's powers as a phenomenal drummer is going to be imparted to me if I lay on his grave. I mean, that's insane. And yet people are doing that in Bethel Redding and other churches like that. Where's their own, that's what Lifton talks about. Your own integrity as a rational human being is out the window, because the dogma says if you go lay on Smith Wigglesworth's grave in England, he was an amazing revivalist back in Victorian era, you're going to get his blessing imparted to you. Okay, let's get on a plane and fly to Smith Wigglesworth's graves. I mean, that's what's going on right now.
Wow, man. You
No
talk
words.
about the look on somebody's face when you tell, you were telling me, I've never heard of that before, ever.
Oh,
I've never heard of that. And you're sitting there talking to that, and I'm just sitting here going,
what?
My mouth's up. I just, what? This is the most magical thinking. This is just sorcery mixed in with Christian belief. I mean, this doesn't have anything to do with Jesus. This is just plain up sorcery. Wow. Necromancy in a way. That's crazy, man. Wow.
Well, maybe what we should do is leave that as a shameless plug for our episode.
Yes.
Because I've been researching this, and I've got pages and pages of stuff that you're not going to believe that's going on in these Dominion churches.
Wow, man. We're definitely going to break all that down. Definitely. I can't wait. Okay. We're going to probably get together next week on that. Okay, so let's hit this next one, and we'll head toward wrapping this thing up. Like I said, this has been something I've wanted to do for a long time. I'm really glad we're doing this.
Yeah, it's been great.
All right, this last point is called dispensing of existence. What this involves, according to Lifton, is this, quote, "Those who have not seen the light and embraced the truth are wedded to evil, tainted, and therefore, in some sense, usually metaphorical, lack the right to exist." Okay, let me repeat that. They lack the right to exist. That is one reason why a cult member threatened with being cast into outer darkness may experience a fear of extinction or collapse. End quote. Hassan also states that cults implant fears and phobias in followers, such as the fear of hell, or extinction, or shunning, or the real danger of being forcibly pulled out of the group by family or friends and deprogrammed. Filling members with fears of deprogrammers, for example, makes one shelve their questions and doubts. One's very spiritual survival is at stake. And if we, connecting dots here psychologically, what effect does this have on a person? Well, quote, "The polar emotional conflict is the ultimate existential one of being versus nothingness. He's likely to be drawn into a conversion experience, which he sees as the only means of attaining a path of existence for the future." End quote. Thus, the totalist environment stimulates a total fear of annihilation or of extinction in the follower. One can only overcome this fear and find confirmation only in the fount of all existence, the totalist organization. Additionally, dispensing of existence is a very real threat to members who might otherwise contemplate leaving. Being shunned equals the loss of one's community, family, friends, etc. Boy, I could go on this one for a while, but I want to hear what you have to say on this. I'm intensely curious.
Oh yeah, well, it happens all the time in churches. This shunning thing, if you question the sacred science, if you question the preacher's message or any sort of criticism, you could easily find yourself on the outside, gone, and you've lost your friends, your family, your community that you've depended on for support for decades. I mean, I've just talked to two friends of mine within the last 6 months that I went to Bible college with over 20 some years ago. Within the last 6 months, both of them pastors of major large churches, one in Pennsylvania, one in California, who were both railroaded out of their churches and publicly shamed and disgraced, even though none of it was true, because they were daring to question the status quo and trying to make some changes. And beloved pastors of more than 10 years of these churches, bam, found themselves on the outside quicker than you can say. And I mean, it's unbelievable how fast the whole thing went down. And this is the dispensing of existence. They did it to these guys. They were the pastors of the churches, and they ran them out, because they were shaking the boat too much or whatever it was. You're gone. You're out. You don't exist anymore.
Wow.
So it happens all the time. I've lost family members, friends, they don't talk to me anymore because I'm speaking out against this stuff and I'm the enemy now, and that's how it works.
Yep, that is exactly how it works.
Mm-hmm.
There's another aspect to this that's also just as much an existential threat against members, and that is, in Scientology, it's expressed as you're going to lose your eternity.
Mm-hmm.
If you leave the church, if you don't go all the way up the bridge to total freedom, if you fail to conform to the standards or rules and buck the system or whatever, then you're threatening your eternity. You're losing your eternity. That's a big, powerful word, especially for Scientologists, eternity, because if you believe that you are an immortal spiritual being who literally cannot be killed, then really the only question about your existence is the quality of your existence into the future. You've already had a really crap-ass past, and Scientology is promising to deal with all of that trauma and stress and free you of that burden. But if you carry on into the future and you don't do something about all that, and you don't follow Scientology's closely taped route out of this, then you are going to spend the rest of eternity in the dark, crawling around in the mud. And this is how they talk. This is exactly how they talk, right?
Wow.
In the trap, stuck on this prison planet, and you will never, ever, ever escape your bonds, and you're basically relegating yourself to a prisoner existence, a slave existence. This is the threat that Scientology levels against people if they try to buck the system or say, hey, I'm not so sure about all this stuff. And I don't know that disconnection is really the way to go. Well, we had to, because this guy was threatening all of us. He was threatening our eternities. He was threatening, our everything, our entire mission. So he had to go. Well, what did he do? Well, he was speaking out on the internet, or he was X, or he was Y, or whatever. It doesn't really matter what he was doing. He was bucking the church. And this existential threat is actually something that stuck with me for a really long time. Not because I thought that I hadn't continued to buy into the Scientology structure, the idea of thetans and stuff, but this business of ceasing to exist was, and continues in some degree. I mean, over the years, it's become less of a thing for me, but it's still very, very, very much present in my thinking. So when I say it's less of a thing, I mean it's not an extremist idea in my mind anymore, but it's still very much there, that ceasing to exist is the ultimate bad thing to happen to you. Is the ultimate awfulness, and I've still had a hard time overcoming that. And I think one of the reasons is because I think like you, I'm second gen. Was raised in this. I've never had. I didn't have the pre-cult personality. This is we didn't talk about this too much. This is kind of its own thing. But when you're a second gen cult member, or you're raised in a group, right? And this applies. We say second gen, but it really means third, fourth, fifth, sixth, 10th, whatever.
Yeah.
If you're raised in it, if you never had any other worldview, then this is your worldview. And coming out of that and not having anything to fall back on means you have to create your entire existence from scratch. And you got to create a whole nother system of belief and worldview and way of relating to other people, and everything is hitting the reset button. And this is very much part of it, because this sticks with you. At least it stuck with me, and I'll happily project this onto other people, that I think it sticks with them too. That that your life has a certain degree of meaninglessness and purposelessness, and you're kind of doomed, because you're going to cease to exist at some point. And isn't that the most awful thing that could ever happen to somebody? And I still to this day have not really overcome that yet. And I've talked about that a little bit, but that's a thing.
It's a big thing. And I was going to say, the example on the counter side, the evangelical side, is for a lot of us ex-evangelicals, the fear of hell is similar. People report, I've talked to loads of ex-evangelicals who say, for me, the last big hurdle to overcome is, giving up the fear of hell. If we're wrong, we're going there. The stakes are incredibly high. If I've walked away from the church and the faith and God and everything else and renounced it all, I'm going to hell in that construct, And I can remember as a kid being terrified that I was going to get left behind in the rapture and I was going to go to hell, and I was traumatized as a kid, for the same kind of things. And those phobias were implanted in me at a very young age, and it's still there. Those triggers can be right there. This is something I've been working on probably the last couple of years, is addressing this issue of being triggered and what that's all about. And that all goes back to those phobias and fears that were implanted in me as a kid and growing up in the church. So yeah, it's absolutely psychologically damaging on a lot of levels.
Exactly. And we who have seen behind the curtain, we know all the mechanisms. We've seen exactly how they do what they do, and yet still some of this stuff sticks. It just speaks to the power of this stuff.
Absolutely. And that's why I appreciate what Lifton did in going through all those things. Hopefully people can see that flow from kind of start to finish, and how they all relate to each other, as well as we talked about the psychological impact that's why people are in therapy, recovering from religion. You know, I remember talking to Dr. Daryl Ray on my podcast, and this whole thing about recovering from religion. I keep saying, isn't that the most ironic thing? Religion's supposed to give us peace and love and enlightenment and forgiveness. And instead, what it gave us was trauma and abuse and all these horrible things, you know, and we've got to recover from it. This is insane, but we have to do all the work.
It sucks.
Yeah.
You know, it really does. You know, but I would rather, as I've adopted, you know, from critical thinking and other places, I guess, you know, I would rather live with an uncomfortable truth than a pleasing, you know, lie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And and there are, you know, I'm not going to lie about this or sugarcoat it. You know, being an agnostic or an atheist, it isn't the easiest route. It's not the path of least resistance. It's easy to hand everything over to some infinite creator in the beyond and imagine that this person has your back and that you're going to be infinitely rewarded for your good behavior in this life, as you happen to define good behavior, by the way, because I've seen some of the worst behavior out of certain religious believers. Of all denominations and all faiths, by the way, not just Christianity. So I'm not trying to just Christian bash here. You know, you see horrible behavior from some of these people, and they are absolutely positive that they are facing they're going to get wonderful rewards at the end of it all. You know, so clearly it's very, very easy to fall into this mindset. It is much more difficult to face the reality that none of that might be true, and this might be all there is. So make the best of it, because this is what you get.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so it can be a rough go. You know, and I think you know, sometimes we even struggle a little bit with how to because religion-based sympathy or condolences or expressions are so rife in the Western world. We even have a hard time sometimes with expressing condolences or sympathy, because you know it's like, you know, we don't get to say my prayers are with you, or I'm praying for you, or I'm you know soliciting a higher power to see over you or something. We don't go there with any of that. We just go, God damn, that sucks. You know, shit, man, I'm really sorry that's happening to you, because that sucks. You know, and that's about as, you know, as much as you can do. And you know, it's like I said, it doesn't make life easier necessarily.
But exactly right. Falling back on the platitudes, it does terminate the thoughts and that quells the cognitive dissonance. I was just saying before we started recording that my mother-in-law very suddenly recently passed away, and we're seeing and hearing the platitudes from the evangelical side of the family, to be expected, you know. And yeah, it sucks. And my wife was like saying, why has this happened? But I would have fallen back on all those platitudes, you know, when I was a Christian, because it's just so easy. It's so convenient. God has a plan. I don't know. He needed another angel in his choir. I don't know. Now she just had a stroke. Shit happens, man. She died. And it sucks and it's bullshit and everything else. And we're angry and grieving and everything, but it just happened. That's it, man. It just happened. Shit happens. You have to deal, you know, period.
Yeah, exactly. And it's you know, it's cold comfort in a way, and I get it.
Yeah.
I totally get it. You know, it's not like this is like some foreign concept or idea to us atheists, that dealing with loss and trauma and stress is difficult. You know, but like I said, I'll take facts and evidence any day. You know, over appeals to emotion and some invisible hand of authority that's supposedly guiding my life. And you know, and if I'm wrong, then I guess at some point I'll face the music for that. But you know, it's also a little difficult to just as a, I don't know, I didn't really mean to go in here, but since we're talking about it, it's a little difficult for me to go in the direction of a kind, forgiving, wonderful God, because he certainly hasn't done a whole lot to make himself very clear as to which one I'm supposed to believe in. There are thousands of denominations of Christianity alone. There are way more people, you know, who are Hindu, Buddhist in the world. What about all them? Are they all going to hell?
Yeah, if it's a pure numbers game, there's millions of Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists, and And if God could easily solve this problem by just coming down and appearing before everyone and saying, hey, the Muslims are wrong, the Hindus are wrong, the Buddhists are wrong. It's these Christians over here that have it right,
Exactly. It's like
Okay,
that South Park
that's it.
episode where they all end up in hell and they're like, well, which one got it right? And the devil's like, the Mormons. The Mormons got it right, and
Joseph Smith had it right.
Yeah, and you just go, oh, okay, all right. If I could just get one thing, that was like that was a real world thing, not just some subjective epiphany that that I can't put any stock in. If I could just get one thing that said, here it is. This is undeniable proof that either Jesus is real or Buddha is real or the Westboro Baptists are the ones who are getting it right. Like whichever one it is, I actually don't care. I would happily go bow down, do the whole number. I'd be happy to do that if that was a real thing. But I just can't get myself in that headspace, and I just don't see any evidence of it. So that's where I go, and that's also the reason why, because I'm willing to be wrong about all of this, is why I feel that I think that's the strength of behind, or the backbone of tolerance, is a willingness to acknowledge that you could be wrong. And so therefore you'll be willing to see other people's point of view and grant that they might be right. And that's okay,
Well, and going back to something you said at the top of the show, we were talking about, the thing about fundamentalism or cults is they provide a lot of beautiful prepackaged answers to all of life's big questions. Why does this happen? Well, because God's got a plan, or whatever engrams. That's why, or whatever. Xenu, that's your prepackaged answer. And there's comfort and solace in that. But as you said, it's a constructed reality. You're entering into the constructed reality of L. Ron Hubbard, or the Bible, or the Quran, or the Bhagavad, whatever the sacred science text of that particular religion. And once you go down that line, now you're susceptible to all the controls and everything we've been talking about. So it seems like it offers a lot of solace, but man, it's hugely psychologically damaging in so many ways.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, that is provable. That is evidence-based. That is something that does respond to treatment and therapy. We can see the cause and the effect. There's no question about this. Nothing we've talked about in this entire podcast is something you have to take on faith. There are thousands of case studies that back this information up. So I'll go with that. That's where I'm going to put my stock right now. And given the brain that God gave me, that's the logical conclusion that I would come to. So if God's going to punish me for that, I don't know. I just think that's pretty screwed up. So
especially when you're helping so many people free themselves from the bonds of that controlling religion, whatever it might be. I mean, this thing about religious trauma syndrome, this is something I've been talking about on my podcast with a couple of psychotherapists recently. I mean, that's a thing. Like you said, it's a thing. It's a real diagnosable thing that millions of people have suffered and have gotten treatment and help for because of religious trauma.
Exactly.
It's a thing.
Yeah, it's a thing. And
it's being more and more talked about every day. A friend of mine's hosting a conference in Vancouver in 2020, the Conference on Religious Trauma, where all these speakers are going to come and talk about it, specialists and everything. And it's becoming more of a thing that, it's a real, psychological problem, and we need help to deal with it.
Exactly. Okay, and if we haven't alienated every religious believer out there yet, let me say, yeah, exactly. Let me say, look, that is not to say that having religion is a mental illness. And people will hear things like that, and they'll jump to these, pretty radical conclusions that we're saying, this, when it's not what we're saying. The assertion is that there are people who experience religion to an extreme level and get psychologically damaged over the process. That is not to say that every single person who has religion is is mentally ill or defective in
Mhm.
some fashion or anything like
Yeah,
that.
absolutely.
Religion has, there are very, very solid, known, good reasons why we have religion. This is not some big mystery in sociology or psychology, evolutionary psychology even. Like we understand why this exists, and it's not
Mm,
like it is in and of itself an inherently evil thing. But when you
mm,
dial that dial up to 11, as we've been talking about here through this whole episode, that's where you get problems.
mm.
And I just, I always have to sort of put these caveats in because people get so freaked out about, questioning their faith. Again, and we've expressed exactly why during the course of the podcast: the cognitive dissonance,
Mhm.
and out come the thought-stopping cliches, right? We're of the devil. We are, spiritually blind. We are SPs. We are,
Mhm.
libtard snowflakes. We are, or on the other hand, we're, fascist Nazis or whatever.
Yeah.
It goes on all ends.
Mhm.
So, my appeal to the world at large is, hey, look, if you find yourself, expressing thought-stopping cliches and thought-terminating cliches like I was just expressing just now, you might possibly,
Mhm.
be in a cult, or you might possibly
Yeah.
be in a position at least where you can't contemplate certain ideas. And that's not freedom of thought, you know? That's just not what that
Exactly.
is.
You
So,
might be the frog in the water.
yeah,
Slowly the heat gets turned up and you're now boiling and you didn't see that's the whole point of indoctrination, isn't it? It's incremental. Like you said, those guys in Om Shinrikyo didn't walk in on day one and get handed a suitcase with sarin gas in it. Hey, go and release this in the subways in Tokyo. It took years of indoctrination for them to willingly, blindly carry out that order and kill people. So it's a process. And they didn't see it as that as it took place over the course of months and years.
exactly.
Mm.
Exactly. All right, man. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. I really, really appreciate your ideas on this and putting this together on the Lifton criteria. I'm imagining future content revolving around Lifton and some of this stuff some more too, because this man is
Mm.
a deep well of knowledge on
Mm-hmm.
this topic, and like I said, he's the OG on the whole thing. So,
Mm-hmm.
so I've always admired his work from the first day that I hit on it back in 2014, and I really haven't talked about it enough. So, thank you for joining me on this, Clint.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I've absolutely had a blast talking to you. As always, I love talking to you. Anytime you want to chat, just hit me up. We're going to have you on Mindship podcast as well. So I'm sure we're going to work that out in another
Yep.
episode too. Well, we want to talk about Scientology. I haven't talked to you about specifically some of the beliefs in Scientology, although we've talked about it in this one here today a little bit. But yeah, that's another one we have to do.
Absolutely. I'm totally there. We'll get it scheduled up.
Okay, great.
All right, man. So, the audience out there, hey, I hope you, thanks for sticking with us for what it was a very, it was over 2 hours here. We've been covering some great stuff. I hope that you have any questions, comments, or feedback. And if you do, leave them in the comment section here on YouTube or at sensiblyspeaking.com. I would be very, very interested in what you have to say about all of this. Good, bad, or sideways, it's okay. But if it's bad, prepare for some responses because, I don't just ignore all of the criticism that comes my way. I like to challenge it, and so maybe that'll happen if you leave some comments in the show description here. So thanks for coming around, guys. I will see you next week. Bye bye.